So we have Shianne Lindsay. She will be presenting on wild bee utilization of engineered pollinator habitats in eastern Nebraska agroecosystems. So let you get set up, and when you're ready, you can take it away.
Okay, are you able to see everything okay on the slide?
Yeah, looks great for me.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Shianne Lindsay. I am a current master's student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln here in the state of Nebraska, United States. I'm advised by Dr. Autumn Smart in the UNLV lab. My contact information is here on this front slide, so feel free to reach out to me at any point after the presentation. I'll show it again later. But my thesis project is entitled The Wild Bee Utilization of Engineered Pollinator Habitat in Eastern Nebraska Agroecosystems. And today I'm going to be showing some of the preliminary work that I have collected so far. So setting the stage a little bit, why this is overall so important is due to the current state that is the Nebraska landscape, and as well as much of the Midwest. 92% of my state is farmland, and that has resulted from a 98% prairie loss and a 25% loss of wetlands, and most of this has been converted to farmable land. This is pretty consistent across surrounding states and much of this region. In total, making up over 127 million acres of farming lands in the Midwest. There is some remaining habitat scattered throughout, though it is very fragmented and quality can be questionable at times. A lot of this is virgin prairie or prairie lands that have been resorted back to long-term plantings, as well as a lot of these small patches of restored pollinator habitats that are scattered within the farming lands as crop edges, fire breaks, and more. Overall, I want to know what the contribution of providing this habitat is. So these small scale, short-term pollinator plantings that are within these agricultural systems. I'm calling them engineered habitats. That's not a very widely used term, but to me, it makes sense. To engineer something is to plan, construct, and manage it. And that is exactly what we are doing with developing these habitats to be put into these greater agroecosystems. And more specifically, I want to know what plants are providing the greatest benefit and contribution to the landscape and to the bee community that we think is here. Just to reiterate, though, of these habitats that I'm talking about, we are most interested in these native habitats. These native plants are going to serve the greatest purpose to the native bees that we have here and the other native pollinators. They serve as host plants, nesting resources, and preferred food resources for these species. And but it is important to test these compared to the wild habitats, as well as some of the non-native species that seem to be increasingly encroaching on these wild landscapes. This information in total is going to be most beneficial to the land managers, the people who are actively farming this land. They're making up over 92% of this landscape. So how can we make this information accessible to them and make it appealing to be providing these habitats for the wild bees? And these recommendations can be enhanced by private, public, and government-funded agencies. Just to kind of wrap that up, though, this is not meant to be an end-all, be-all for pollinators. There is substantially more work that needs to be done in order to determine what we can do to lessen our detrimental impact and conserve the bee species here that are in decline. But this is a step one and something that we can actively be working on to be headed in the right direction in conserving these species. The bee species in question are the bees of Nebraska. We've estimated there's between 400 and 500 bee species here. This is likely an outdated number. There hasn't been a statewide survey that has happened here in quite a long time, except for the Bumblebee Atlas, which is focused entirely on the genus Bombus. There is a list of species within that genus that are likely extinct in the state and are endangered in other states due to their declining numbers and drastically declining habitats and ranges in which they are found. Here in my region, which is in eastern Nebraska, Bombus fraternus and Bombus pennsylvanicus are 2 species of great conservation interest as outlined by the Bumblebee Atlas. And that is because Bombus fraternus is IUCN listed as an endangered species, and Pennsylvanicus is IUCN listed as at risk. And both of these have suffered over a 50% decline in both range and numbers. There is likely a lot other bees at risk, though because we haven't had a statewide survey done, we don't really know, and they are highly underrepresented in our literature and museum records here in the state. So these habitats, these engineered pollinator habitats that we're going to be talking about, are outlined by a few of these primary seed mix companies, being the NRCS seed mix through the USDA, the USDA CRP mix, we got CP38 and CP42, which are the main ones that are used here for pollinator habitat. In the state specifically, we have the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund and the Stock Seed Farms pollinator mix. And what all of these have in common is they are high diversity form mixes mixed with native bunch grasses, though their initial plan isn't necessarily to conserve bee species and provide bee resources. Most of these landowners are actually supplying these resources because they want to have hunting lands, and because they want to provide pheasant habitat, or because they want a fire break around their property. Some of these landowners that I'm working with also have honeybees, so they want some sort of resources to provide foraging for their honeybee colonies that they have. So the bee conservation of the wild bees isn't the primary focus, but it definitely can be geared towards that if we made the right recommendations. I'm looking at my specific research question is what the impact is of establishing these short-term pollinator plantings within the agroecosystem, and more specifically, what bees are using what flowers during what time of year and for how long. So we're going to be looking at each of these plantings in the early, mid, and late season throughout the summer. So that's going to be early June, mid-July, and late August. Each of these times of year have a different peak of bloom time in the diversity, species, and overall number of blooms, as well as different overlaps within the bee communities that are found here with flight times and what their nesting ecology is. And to look at these interactions, I'm going to be identifying the plant and wild bee networks within these engineered pollinator habitats, and comparing the efficacy of these seed mixes. So comparing between the different companies, what plants and at what densities are providing the greatest impact, and how we can possibly meet in the middle, make them better, provide recommendations, as well as making them more accessible for these landowners to provide to their properties. Here is just a map of kind of where I was located. This is eastern Nebraska, ranging from Omaha to about the center of the state. The colors indicate the type of seed mix that was at each of these sites. So the purple is the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. The yellow is going to be the NRCS mix, and the blue is CRP mixes, and the white is the stock seed pollinator mix. Unfortunately, it is a little bit skewed here. Part of the joy of working with private landowners is gaining accessibility and permission to go onto their private lands. So we were able to contact who we could, finding the people who own these properties, and gaining those permissions resulted in the distribution we see here. What all of these sites do have in common, though, is they are about 3 to 5 years post-establishment. We're looking for this sweet spot because the first few years of planting, the flowers haven't quite hit their peak bloom time and haven't quite settled in. Some are very slow to establish. And after the 5 years is kind of when you start getting that weedy encroachment coming in. So this 3 to 5 year mark is allowing us to see, hopefully, the peak in these plantings. Each site is between 5 and 20 acres. And that is because under 5, or just in that sweet spot, is it makes it easier for us to do our sampling. My methodology is in each of these sites. I'm doing 3 2 by 20 meter transects, and at each site, these are Semi-random, we are looking for the areas in the properties which has the greatest flower diversity, so that way we can see these interactions between the bees and the flowers. We are counting the stems of blooming flowers, and by blooming flowers, we're looking for ones that are actively producing nectar and or pollen, and then identifying them to species. And then along these transects, we're doing 10 minutes of sweep netting, hand collection, and visual observation. The sweep netting was more for larger patches of the same species of flowers, so that way we could get all of them at one go, but the hand collection was easier for when the species were more scattered. And if we had one flower over here, another flower over somewhere else, so that way we can get those exact interactions. Visual observations are done for bumblebee queens and honeybees. There's no need to collect thousands of either. So, and we're also able to identify them in the field. So they were released and or counted, noting the flower species they were visiting. These surveys were done 3 times per summer in the anticipated peak bloom times, and the bees were collected and brought back to the lab and are currently being ID'd to species. But for the sake of the data I'm going to be showing, I'm just showing the genus level because I still have a lot of verification in my species IDs I need to get done soon. The photos you're looking at here are 2 properties they're in different locations, but they are the same sampling period. I think these photos were even taken the same day. And these are both the same seed mix that are the same age. So there is a wide variety in the overall quality of these habitats, even if the seed mix is planted the same. So the one on the left is really showing that high diversity forb mix, but on the right is nothing's really seeming to come up. And this could possibly be due to the management of the land or surrounding land use, as well as previous utilization of these lands. Going into the results a little bit, here's just the distribution of the bee genera that we were able to collect off of these pollinator plantings. I still do need to go through and do the species of all of these, so hopefully I'll have more updates next year. But this is definitely leaning a lot towards Apis mellifera, that is the honeybee species we have here in the United States, and it is obviously the most abundant bee we're going to be finding here, but the rest of the bees are all going to be either the bumblebees or the solitary wild bees. So I've got 3 of these figures I'm going to be showing. These are bipartite alluvial plots that are showing these interactions of the top 20 interactions. So these isn't necessarily showing every bee and every flower for each season. Those get really large and very complicated to view. For the sake of this, I'm looking at the most common and most frequent interactions here. So Apis is making up the bulk of what we're seeing here, but bumblebees, Seratina, and Lisioglossums are also quite abundant in the early season. What we're surprised to see here is that the honeybees and the wild bees aren't really overlapping a ton. And you're going to see this in each of the following figures as well, that they're not utilizing the same plants, which we were surprised to see. We were expecting them to have more of a competition aspect that we were able to observe, especially with how small these habitats are. But we really didn't see that, which was really surprising. So the next one is, so these, the species are still kind of interacting on a relatively equal plane. There's a moderate amount of bees and a moderate amount of flowers that are interacting. And a lot of the bees are going to multiple species of flowers. But this changes, especially once we get into the late season, which in my area is very drought heavy, very hot, very little water. One of my field sites had received 0.3 inches of rain this entire summer, which resulted in a very significant lack of resources available. And those primary resources that are being utilized by these late season flying bees are going to be thistles and sunflowers, as well as the goldenrods. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done with this data. This is just a preliminary on what is happening and the directions we are hoping to go soon. The next steps for me are to create a preference rank and an index of the preferred pollinator plants, as well as look at the cost and how we can make these more cost effective. And in the future, I'd love to look at the surrounding land use and compare these to long-term prairie restorations. So this is my acknowledgements, and thank you to everybody who has helped me in all of my funding agencies. Once again, my contact information is here, but I think I ran a little over on time, but I'm happy to take any questions if there's any remaining time. So thank you so much.
30 seconds for this question, so I'll read it to you quick. What was your field prep for the plantings?
So these plantings were done by these seed mix companies. And like I said, they were 3 to 5 years post-establishment. The planting method ranged drastically between the companies and what they had outlined in their contracts. So I didn't personally do any of the field site prep. That was all done already in the past. And that it was outlined by their contracts from the companies.
Thanks so much for that. If there's other questions, maybe they can put them in the Q&A and Shianne can DM you the answers because we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for that presentation.